Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to another of our talks from Friends. A talk tonight in our series of Spies in the Archives. And I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Dan Larson from Cambridge University, who's going to give us a talk this evening on a very interesting aspect in relation to the First World War and the British spying on the Americans. So I'll just introduce Dan. He's a fixed-term college lecturer at Trinity College in Cambridge. He's previously been with the university and held a junior research fellowship at Trinity College. And he has an interest in international relations and is from Omaha in Nebraska. And his main interests of research are in British and American foreign policy and intelligence in the early 20th century. I think this is going to be a fascinating and interesting talk, and I suspect there will be lots of questions. So I'd like, if you could bear this in mind as we go along, if we use the chat function, which is more or less in the middle of your screen at the bottom, if you type your question in there as we go along, at the end of the talk, which will last about 45 minutes, we can then, Dan and I between us, can go down the list and pick them out and hopefully answer them. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you, Dan. You are amongst friends and the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Everybody see that all right?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Well, good. So I'm delighted to be here today to talk about my new book that just came out a few months ago. It was very exciting. Plotting for Peace: American Peacemakers, British Codebreakers, and Britain at War, 1914 to 1917. And there's a lot of dimensions to this work. It's a story of diplomacy, of how American diplomats were able to encourage a significant faction of the British government to be receptive to the idea of an American-mediated compromise peace in the middle of the war. It's a study of high British politics, of the conflict between David Lloyd George and a faction under him on the one side, and Herbert Asquith and a faction under him on the other side, with probably a more robust case for Herbert Asquith as the British Prime Minister, who quite possibly won the war for Britain than you're likely to have seen in previous studies. And but most intriguingly, I think for a lot of people, it's also a study of intelligence and of how British codebreakers were reading all of the American diplomatic communications going between the US and Europe from 1915 onwards. And it's this last aspect that I've been asked to talk about today, and I will launch right into it. So, so our story begins with the Telegraph. The British government, or the British telegraph companies, I should say, had control over almost all of the lines of communication between Great Britain and the United States. As you can see, there's a couple of little telegraph lines going to France, but those didn't work very well and almost nobody used them. Almost all of the messages going from one side of the ocean to the other are going via Britain, which gives Britain a real advantage when it comes to being able to intercept communications. So for example, US communicate, oops, can we go back? What's going on? Okay, US communications, there we go. So for example, US communications to Berlin and to Vienna, they're all being routed via Great Britain. So so whereas British or German code breakers, say, might be able to read American transmissions going from Britain, or French code breakers would be able to get, certain bits of communication going via France. The British are getting everything, just because of the way that communications are set up in this period. And the British are helped in doing this by a set of very weak American codes. So this is an example of the kind of US code book they're using in this period. One thing that you'll notice about this code is that it's actually arranged in alphabetical order. So if you look at the digits, the 300 at the top, and then there's going down the left side 00010203. So that's the code number. So the code number for expressively is 30000. And then as you go right down, it's just all in alphabetical order. This is a terrible code. From 1915 onwards, the British, there's a British code breaking unit called MI1B. It's in the War Office. If you've heard anything about British code breaking in the First World War, you might have heard about Room 40, which is the more famous one in the Admiralty. But there was a smaller one, lesser known, called MI1B in the War Office. And one of the things that it got up to, in addition to breaking some German military codes, was reading the telegrams of the United States. So this is the very first decrypt that survives in British archives from September 25th, 1915. It's just a little bit incomplete. You'll see like a couple of dashes there where they haven't been able to figure it out. But they've just about completely solved the American code books by this point. And so what becomes of all of this information? They have this massive treasure trove of information. And this character here is at the center of it. This is Reginald Hall, who's the chief of British naval intelligence. Ironically, even though it's not British naval intelligence that's producing these decrypts, it's actually British naval intelligence that's the head of British naval intelligence that's at the kind of center of this. He gets access to these from MI1B. There's this marvelous cartoon that's from the National Archives of him. And he's a pretty right-wing political intelligence chief who has no compunction about involving himself in diplomacy and politics, even when really he shouldn't be. The most marvelous quote about him comes from Walter Page, who's the American ambassador to London, who says that for Hall can look through you and see the very muscular movements of your immortal soul while he is talking to you. Such eyes as the man has, which is well, because he hasn't a hair on his head nor a tooth in his mouth. Some dreadful illness once all but killed him and left him, a man of genius, a freak, if you will, as I dare say all men of genius are, my lord. Now he tells me certain things which he doesn't tell his own government. That's my claim to distinction. And given what I've been able to find out about Reginald Hall, this last claim that Reginald Hall is telling the American ambassador certain things that he doesn't tell his own government, that's it's not actually necessarily an idle boast. That Hall had very little compunction about sharing things with people who he thought they should be shared with, and not sharing them with people who he thought they should not be shared with. So what I was expecting when I started this research a good long while ago now was to find a story of how the British took this information and how they used it to manipulate the Americans into the war. That's sort of an obvious thing to think that they have this big intelligence advantage over the Americans. They're collecting all of this insight into American diplomacy, and surely they're using it against the United States. This is what you would think, but in reality, what I found was that they more often tended to use it in their own fights with one another, precisely because the British government was so badly divided over what they should do with respect to the Americans. So these are the two key British leaders here. This is Woodrow Wilson, who was the President of the United States, on the left, and his close personal advisor and confidant, Colonel Edward House, on the right. Now, Edward House doesn't have any kind of official position in the British government, or in the American government, I should say. But he becomes a kind of super secretary of state, a kind of precursor to the later position of national security advisor, where him and Wilson are basically running the country's diplomacy, and the Secretary of State is just a kind of minor figurehead in terms of sort of dealing with the nuts and bolts of various communication. And what these two people want to do is to try to negotiate an end to the First World War. Colonel House goes on a mission to Europe in 1915 and doesn't get much success in trying to get the belligerents around a peace table. And he goes back in 1916. And actually, previous historians have said, oh, it was as much of a failure in 1916 as it was in 1915. And what I've been able to show is that actually it wasn't. And there was a lot of people who were receptive to House's diplomacy in the British government. But Reginald Hall had no compunction about trying to interject himself into this diplomacy. That he endeavored to convince House that we were out to beat the Germans, not by words and treaties, but by horrible deeds of blood. Very colorful letter. And House takes no notice of this. He continues on. So House's own diary entry for when he meets Hall doesn't contain any real details about it. It says it was sort of a mildly interesting evening. But House, as he's talking with the British leadership, generates all of these, generates quite a few decrypts, most of which don't survive in the National Archives, but which we can tell they exist from other sources. But Hall ends up being really frustrated by House because House, he has this really strong telegraphic discipline where he just doesn't actually say very much in his telegrams. And Hall gets pretty frustrated by this, but this time, unlike in 1915, in 1916, House finds some success among the British leadership. And the reason why he finds this success is ultimately economic. So the British were importing huge amounts of goods from the United States, about equal to what France is spending on its entire war effort. The British is trying to bring all these in on behalf of themselves and their allies. And Americans, lenders, really won't provide the British with sufficient loans to finance these. And so the British are trying to do all of it through liquidation of assets. And the problem with assets is that assets are finite. And the British are burning through theirs at a pretty extraordinary rate.
American.
And there's a really big divide in the British government over the severity of this problem. The people on the left, Herbert Asquith, Reginald McKenna, Arthur Balfour, Sir Edward Grey, take this very seriously. They're very worried about what this means, because basically once the assets are gone, all of these American supplies are going to have to stop, and the Allies are going to have to learn how to fight. They're either going to have to end the war, or they're going to have to learn how to fight a very different war that's not dependent on these American supplies. And then on the right, you have Andrew Bonar Law and Lloyd George, who basically refuse to take this problem seriously. Lloyd George in particular is completely contemptuous of the idea that basically Britain's not economically invincible. And we can talk about this a little bit more in the Q&A if you want. But House has more success than people have realized. There's a really good quote that McKenna, the Prime Minister Grey, and Balfour were in favor of accepting President Wilson's good offices, owing to the black financial outlook, while Bonar Law and Lloyd George were averse, as they did not admit of the seriousness of the financial situation. They had not reached a decision, but McKenna thought there was every prospect of the proposal being accepted. Now, ultimately, this doesn't come to pass because, in particular, because Wilson gave a pretty ill-judged speech about a couple of days after this that damaged things, and but this shows that he was making progress, and intelligence, even though it didn't have a really significant impact on early 1916, it ends up having a much more significant impact on later in 1916. Just as because there's wide expectation that the Americans are going to try again for some kind of peace move. But Romania comes into the war in August 1916 on the side of the Allies. And the Americans decide that this means that they can't move until after the US presidential election. There's a US presidential election going on. Wilson is fighting to get reelected. And attempting to do anything in the couple of months before a US presidential election is just going to get sucked into the vortex of US politics. And not be taken seriously, and so the Americans decide they can't do anything until after the election, and the British find this out. It's not a secret. House tells this to the German ambassador. He would have told it to the British ambassador, but the British ambassador just never went to see him. But he tells it to the German ambassador, and Room 40, Reginald Hall's organization, intercepts the report home. So this is from the Admiralty files in the National Archives. The peace mediation of Wilson has been postponed for the present, as being without prospect of success on account of Romania's entry into the war, and our enemy is consequently increased confidence of victory. Wilson does not believe that he will be able to mediate before the election because England might boldly refuse. So the British have this seemingly really important intelligence from a German decrypt from the German ambassador in Washington to Berlin. From early September 1916. And as far as I was able to find out, he shared it with exactly no one, because exactly, well, almost exactly 3 weeks later, the American ambassador sends a telegram from Berlin to Washington, and the American ambassador is providing an overture from the German government. So Germany is anxious to make peace. I can state on the best authority that if the president will make an offer of mediation, according to a particular set of terms, that Germany will accept immediately and state her readiness to send delegates to a peace conference. And this was a German message going from Berlin to Washington. The Americans, as we saw in the previous one, they had no intention of moving with any kind of peace move until the election. But Lloyd George, it seems, saw this one, but didn't see the previous one, because he gets this decrypt, which is showed specifically to him and not to anybody else. from within the War Office. And he rushes out and he gives a very anti-American interview in which he declares that the war's end isn't in sight and that the conflict must go to a finish, must be a knockout. And he basically warns off the American president all but by name, that the peace move by the US or anybody is frowned upon. And the Americans are quite shocked to see this. Not nearly as shocked as Lloyd George's cabinet colleagues, who had no idea that this was coming and are furious, or at least the ones who are more concerned about their relationship with the United States are furious by this. McKenna is irate. Sir Edward Grey sends Lloyd George the angriest letter that, or the letter that comes the closest to angry that Sir Edward Grey ever sends that I've seen. Sir Edward Grey is known for being very even, very temperate and in his tone. Never seems to get very excited. It's as close to angry as Sir Edward Grey gets. But Lloyd George responds to this missive from Grey, and he plays the decrypt like a trump card. So this is October 2nd, 1916. He's the only one who's been able to see this decrypt. And he tells Sir Edward Grey, "My dear Grey, thanks for your letter. I wonder whether you are still of the same opinion after reading MI1's secret information. Have you seen it?" Apparently it was attached to this letter. The decrypt doesn't survive on this particular copy, but it was apparently attached to this letter. And it serves as a kind of effective shield for Lloyd George, that some of his cabinet colleagues have been spoiling for a fight, but at the next meeting of the War Committee, Lloyd George turns up and no one makes a mention of this. In part, it seems because of this decrypt, that he was able to use this as a shield. And even more recklessly, Lloyd George goes to Parliament a couple of weeks later, and he's challenged in Parliament by a Liberal MP over this interview that he gave, and he declares that, and he makes an oblique reference to the decrypt in open Parliament. "I do not withdraw a single syllable. It was essential. I could tell the honourable member how timely it was. I can tell the honourable member it was not merely the expression of my own opinion, but as he brazenly lies to the Commons, but the expression of the opinion of the cabinet, of the War Committee, and of our military advisors," which is of course not true, because his cabinet colleagues were furious with him. But attempting to clarify this or explain this would have meant putting the government's divisions on display, and no one was willing to do that. So Lloyd George gets away with it. And Lloyd George he made this reference to the timeliness of the interview. The press takes notice of this. This is the New York Times. The very next day, Lloyd George hits back at his critics, defends fight to a finish interview, but can't disclose how timely it was. Fortunately, however, the Americans took no notice of this, and a couple of days later, you get a message from the Secretary of State to President Wilson saying, "By some oversight, this flimsy was not forwarded to you promptly." This is the one with the message from the American ambassador in Germany to Berlin, the one that started all this, this sort of dastardly conspiracy that Lloyd George was convinced he was heading off. It finally makes its way to the president about I think it's a full, at least a week, possibly more than a week after Lloyd George, springs into action to head it off. It finally makes its way to the president. "By some oversight, this flimsy was not forwarded to you promptly." Perhaps, however, it is just as well. Since it came, Mr. Lloyd George has given out an authorized statement that the war is to be a fight to the finish, and that any suggestion of peace from neutrals would be considered as more or less unfriendly. So the Americans never put the connection between this, between the British decrypting this telegram together and Lloyd George's interview, even though Lloyd George had possibly made it easy for a perceptive mind to figure that out. Now, the British cabinet over this period starts to again be really worried about, that graph I showed you a moment ago, as British assets are starting to fade and they're no longer going to be able to support their American supplies. And you start to get some renewed talk of possibly allowing the Americans to come in and negotiate a peace. This is Lord Lansdowne, who writes the Lansdowne Memorandum in late 1916, which you might have heard of, in which he argues that the possibility of a negotiated peace should be something that they should at least take seriously. And previous historians have all said that Lansdowne spoke for himself, that he had no support from anyone. But in fact, Lansdowne had quite a bit more support than people have realized. So, for example, this is a minor Liberal cabinet figure. We asked for a special cabinet on this, the Lansdowne Memorandum. Military authorities to give us their view as to the probabilities of a knockout. We also want statements as to future finance and shipping, both very bad. I think the latter will be critical and perhaps conclusive by next spring. The submarine danger, another example of support for Lansdowne. The submarine danger menaces our whole position. Russia is still unprepared, France exhausted, Italy fatigued, Germany increasing her strength internally to compensate for military failures. How long can we last? But all of these debates get swept away by none other than David Lloyd George. Lloyd George launches his intrigues against Asquith a couple of weeks later in early December 1916. And when the dust is settled, all of the people who were willing to consider the possibility of negotiation in November 1916 were all out of the government. Lloyd George is now the prime minister. But he continues to be poorly served by intelligence. So the German ambassador, the German government in Berlin sent a telegram to the German ambassador in Washington. Getting these straight. German government in Berlin sent a message to the German ambassador in Washington, which had a big long telegram. But because for technical reasons, the Germans had just recently changed their codes. But for technical reasons, messages in quotes that might be had by another government, for security reasons, those are left in a weaker code. So in this long telegram, there were two sentences that British intelligence was able to decrypt because they had been sent in an older code because they were quotations. So what the president is this quotation. What the president now most earnestly desires is a practical cooperation on the part of German authorities in bringing about a favorable opportunity for an early and affirmative action by the president looking to immediate restoration of peace. This is actually a bit of criticism of the German government. The American president is really annoyed at various things the Germans have been doing that have been getting in his way. And then there's this other quote, extremely gratified to see from the president's message that in the given moment, we could count upon the sincere and practical cooperation of the president at the restoration of peace, which is not really what the president had in mind when he was asking for German sort of practical cooperation. But what British intelligence does is they have no idea what the rest of this message says. They've just got these two quotes that they figured out what they say. And so British intelligence issues this decrypt in which they pass off these two random quotes from this as if they were two separate telegrams that they had intercepted that were complete, and these get passed off to the government as if this is complete intelligence, and it consists only of these two random quotes, and this inflames Lloyd George. He's convinced. I mean, he was convinced a couple months earlier that the Americans and Germans were plotting together, even though it wasn't true, and this just makes him even more convinced the Americans and Germans are plotting together, even though it's not true. And when the Americans, they do make a kind of very coded sort of minor peace move about a week after this decrypt, and Lloyd George is all ready to come out swinging, and to tell the United States that they're not going to tell them anything in response to this. President Wilson asks for both sides to kind of state their terms, just to see if there's any possibility of overlap. And Lloyd George has to be talked down from this sort of intelligence-fueled anger in order to giving the Americans a more constructive response that doesn't harm Britain's relationship with the United States. And so the final episode of Lloyd George and intelligence that I want to talk about has to do with Austria-Hungary. So Austria-Hungary gets a new emperor in at the end of 1916. Franz Josef passes away, and Austria-Hungary is now in the hands of Karl, who's 29 years old. And in charge of the country. And what Karl is desperate for is for a negotiated end of the war. The British government is kind of interested in dealing with Austria-Hungary, because what they want is a separate peace. So to get Austria-Hungary out of the war, so that all the Allies have to do is fight Germany and not Germany and Austria-Hungary. There's some messages going from Austria-Hungary to the United States, and Lloyd George has a conversation with Walter Page. This is the American ambassador to London, the one who was very, very impressed with Hall at the beginning. Ambassador Page has basically gone native, and he's become very convinced about the rightness of the British war effort. And the two of them are talking. Page has been instructed to try to get some negotiations going between Britain and Austria-Hungary by President Wilson. And Lloyd George makes a really startling confession. Lloyd George is very worried about the possibility of negotiating with the Americans, because he thinks there's been a leak in Washington. It's possible that British intelligence had never told him how these decrypts were being generated, like where they were getting the text of these messages from. And so Lloyd George tells the American ambassador to London that as Walter Page writes, Lloyd George's fear is based on an apprehension of a leak at Washington. Lloyd George knows that news of your instruction to me got out at Washington somehow and was telegraphed here by someone in the British embassy or in the British spy service. Although this implies a compliment to their service, he is afraid that other persons also may hear of it. And so Lloyd George makes this kind of fecklessly irresponsible confession to the American ambassador that he either made in the spur of the moment or because he was genuinely concerned about leaks, because his government hadn't told them how they were getting the text of these messages, of these American telegrams. And the possibility for some pretty serious disruption of the Anglo-American relationship is there. All Walter Page has to do is tell this to Washington. But what does Walter Page do? He originally includes this in a draft of a letter to the president. but then crosses it out multiple times, sets it aside in his personal files, and evidently never speaks of the matter again. And this is so the last thing I was going to talk about is the Zimmermann telegram, but that is a pretty well-known story. I have a new spin that I put on the Zimmermann telegram, but I'm afraid that will have to wait for the book or for another time, although you're welcome to ask me about it in questions perhaps. Yes, so that's a sampling of some of the very juicy findings that I have found in the National Archives and in a great many other archives across Britain and the United States. In my book, Plotting for Peace, which is available in all good bookshops, and a special deal from the National Archives bookshop, as I understand it. So anyway, I'm happy to take some questions now. Hope that was interesting.
That's great, Daniel. Thank you very much. Can you unshare your screen?
Oh, yes. Stop share. There we go.
That's great. Good. Okay. Absolutely fascinating. So if you've got any questions, please can you pop them into the chat, and then Daniel and I can pick them out as we go along. I suppose one place to start, Dan, is were the Americans doing something similar to us? Or completely one-way traffic?
That's a very good question. Insofar as we know, it was all one way. So the Americans, the British only get started with code breaking in modern times, at least, at the beginning of the First World War. The Americans only joined the game when they joined the First World War in April 1917. And so it's possible that the Americans might have gotten, like it's a very slow ramp up for the US. So it's unlikely that they were doing it during the war. It's possible the Americans might have been breaking some British codes in the 20s. We don't have any really good research on that. I haven't seen anything to suggest that they were, but it's possible the Americans might have gotten to that in the 20s. But the British, on the other hand, were breaking American codes right from 1915 without interruption until 1942, when they stopped as the US comes into the Second World War.
Yeah. What happened when America came into the First World War?
The British just carry on breaking American codes. It's a great story, or it's a great subject for someone to look at. As to what continued influence this code breaking has. My book stops in America in April 1917 as the US comes into the war, because that's the point at which any kind of possibility of American interest in a negotiated peace stops.
Yes,
because that's the kind of the center of the narrative. But it's a great question as to what impact British breaking of American codes has from April 1917 until
where's the chat thing?
Paris Peace Conference, really, because they
That says share screen.
the whole time and nobody's
Reactions? No.
yes, Ian, please can you mute? You've interrupted. Daniel, I was going to come back and ask about America, whether you thought, well, they must have been aware of security, hence codes, but they must have been aware that there may have been some attempts, or were they just benign to the fact that Britain wouldn't do that sort of thing to them?
Well, it depends. So Walter Page is clearly of the view that Britain, that he's such good friends with Britain that there's no way that Britain would have done these things, or been breaking American codes, because he that sort of really that quote that I found at the end there comes just after the Zimmermann telegram comes out, or that he learns about the Zimmermann telegram. So he knows that Britain's doing code breaking, and he just thinks it can't. They wouldn't be doing it to him. But Colonel House, on the other hand, he clearly gets an inkling that his telegrams might not be safe, because in 1915 his telegrams are really detailed, and he sends all kinds of details about everything that he's doing to the president. But in 1916, when he comes back, he tells the president again and again and again, I send details to you in the diplomatic pouch to be sure of the safety of our messages. And he keeps his telegrams super short. He gives the president like the bare bones of what the president might need in a telegram, and otherwise he says all of the details are going to be in a letter in the diplomatic pouch where it's going to be safe. So House is clearly suspicious, at least, that his telegrams might not be safe.
Anne's asking, do you think that all the records are being released, or is there still some that's redacted?
So on the British side, everything is out so far as we know. The final records, I think it was about 2009, 2008, were the last ones. I think there's one page of some random bit of like intelligence about Ireland that got retained, which might be out now. I haven't gone to look. That was retained about a decade ago. But otherwise everything that they have is out. The big problem actually is that so little of it has been kept. So I mean, I threw up some of the things that I had found on the National Archives in the presentation, but a big problem, because most of those records came out in the 90s and were sent to the National Archives in the 90s, and no one had done anything with them, because the records are pretty fragmentary, and you have to like putting that together was a real kind of puzzle work of looking for, we've got some decrypts. Not a lot of decrypts. A lot of them have been destroyed, but we've got some decrypts in the National Archives. But I found that like the most sensible thing to do was just to look at the text of original American messages, and then compare them to what British policymakers are writing and saying, and looking for similarities. And a lot of times, there's a letter. Or there's an American telegram that says X, Y, and Z, and then you find a British policymaker's letter 3 days later that says we have evidence of X, Y, and Z, and you're like, well, that's clearly where it came from.
So what do you think prompted Britain to start targeting American telegraph traffic in the first place?
Mostly just because they could. So the original group, MI1B, so far as I can tell, the decision to start breaking these codes was made at a really low level. It might have been made at a more senior level, but there's no record of it. So our best guess is that it happened at a lower level. MI1B had started the war breaking German army codes. Because the Germans had were sending these wireless messages to the Western Front, in August 1914, to communicate among the different divisions. A lot of it's going via wireless, which the British can intercept. But as the front becomes static, the Germans replace all of these wireless communications with telegraph lines, which the British can't intercept. So MI1B has nothing to do. And so to justify their continued existence, they start tackling neutral diplomatic communications. And if you're going to tackle neutral diplomatic communications, well, who are you going to start with? the most important neutral is the United States. And so, but by the end of the war, MI1B is breaking French codes, Russian codes, Italian codes, which again is an angle that's probably well open for research as to what impact these have. But yeah, MI1B is breaking everybody's codes, and just about. And but yeah, they start with the US just because they have nothing better to do, and the US is important, insofar as I've been able to tell.
And all the telegraph traffic came through London.
And yes, and exactly, yeah, all the telegraph traffic is coming through London, which wouldn't have been true of some of these other countries. That there would have only been the ambassador in London that they would get, as opposed to with the US, where they get everything.
Yes, for sure. Just remind everyone, the chat button is in the middle of the screen at the bottom. If you've got a question for Daniel, please tap something in. We've had one from Anne, so if you've got any questions, please pop up. So we don't really know then what huge volume there was of traffic. We can only assume that it was a tremendous amount, but only a certain amount of it survives in the archives. An awful lot of it has been lost.
Yeah, lots of it has been lost. So like a big problem is just determining who is seeing these decrypts, because there are only 3 decrypts I was able to find in a policymaker's papers. They were all in Lloyd George's papers, and all 3 of them told him to destroy the decrypt after he read it, which he didn't do. And that's the only reason why we have them.
Yeah. Okay. We've got some questions. First one's from Isaac. I'm an international relations student and run a global NGO. My question pertains to peace diplomacy and intelligence. How should non-state actors assist in third-party government affairs when it comes to policy or intelligence matters? Well, I guess there weren't that many non-governmental actors in those days, were they?
Non-state actors. So yeah, I mean, the Vatican gets involved in peace negotiations a little bit. Whether one considers the Vatican to be a non-state actor.
The state of the Vatican, I don't know.
Because the Vatican does kind of behave like a state in certain ways. But they try to get a little bit involved in peace diplomacy. But I mean, the real problem with any other peace diplomacy apart from that of the United States is that there's no real leverage to be had, because the Americans are the ones that have the leverage, particularly over the Allies, to a lesser extent against the Central Powers.
And it's financial, isn't it? Essentially financial.
But yeah, otherwise, I mean, I can't really think of non-state actors. I mean, other than the extent that Colonel House was had no official government position, but he was basically Wilson's representative.
Yeah.
So it's a good question, but it's not one that there's a lot of lessons to be had from the First World War, so far as I can tell.
I think probably. Okay, Lloyd George, how sincere genuine do you think the Germans were wanting to seek peace in 1916?
Yes, but the question is on what terms. So the Germans were genuine in wanting peace in 1916, but what they want is basically a form of German victory, a kind of moderate German victory. And that's the real problem. That's one of the central problems the U.S. faces in dealing with Germany, is this problem that the United States wants or Wilson and House at least want the war to end on a kind of genuine compromise, the peace without victory. as he's sort of famous for saying.
Yeah.
And German, and it's pretty clear, or at least the Americans think, and accurately so, that what Germany wants is to kind of cash in its superior battlefield position. And so that's one of the real problems is how for any kind of peace is how is Germany, like, if the peace is going to be a compromise one and not a German victory, how is Germany going to be persuaded to give up its advantageous battlefield position? So I'm actually working on an article on American-German peace diplomacy at the moment. So I've got some more research to do for that, but that's as far as I am with that one.
Yes, and I suppose by 1916 the balance hadn't yet shifted. So peace without victory, shall we say, was not going to be a runner, was it? As far as the Germans were concerned, it would have had to have been to their advantage. And we got a question from Ian. As I understand it, Karl's peace overture was primarily to the French through his wife's brother. Is this right? And were the British aware of what Karl was trying to do?
Yes. So this is really interesting because this is basically the whole last chapter of the book. Is that the Austro-Hungarians are pursuing two routes in early 1917. One is his wife's brother, Prince Siext. There we go. Who is attempting to negotiate primarily with the French, and then the second is with the Americans. So the kind of thing that I was talking about a little bit to set up Lloyd George's irresponsible disclosure. And what happens is that the Zimmermann telegram, which is one of the more famous First World War intelligence episodes, when Germany or the British revealed to the Americans that Germany had offered Mexico 3 American states, and it makes the Americans very annoyed. But one thing that people haven't realized is that what it does is it blows up these negotiations between Karl and the United States. Wilson, like as soon as he gets the Zimmermann telegram, Wilson, who had been very creative and energetic in pursuing peace negotiations with Karl, suddenly backs away, and just as Karl, makes an extraordinary concession to the Americans. He tells the Americans that he's willing to have secret and confidential discussions with the Americans and with the Allies ahead of the General Peace Conference. But this is a huge concession, and Wilson throws the message into the fire because he's so annoyed by the Zimmermann telegram. So the British know of what Karl is doing with Prince Siext with the French. But Wilson doesn't. Wilson never finds out because he blew up this route of communication, these negotiations with Austria-Hungary, and so Wilson never finds out about this other bit of peace diplomacy that Karl's involved in until it all becomes public much later. So anyway, that's the whole story of the last chapter of the book, which is really interesting.
Okay, everybody, buy the book.
Yeah.
And there's a friend's discount at the bookshop, and Dan has signed some book plates, so you can get a signed copy as well. There are ways around doing these things in times of pandemics and that. So Daniel, thank you very much. That was very interesting. We very much appreciate your time talking to us this evening, and we hope all goes well with future books and articles. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. This has been a real pleasure. It's always fun to get to talk about these things.
I shan't ask people to unmute and clap loudly, but I'm sure they will show their appreciation in other ways. So. There we are. That's a big thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Okay, we've got a couple more talks to show you that are coming up before we have a break in August, and I'll get Maggie to pop them up on the screen for you. And we've got one on the 1st of September. Amanda Bevan from TNA is going to be talking to us about some of the material from the prize papers. The papers from the High Court of Admiralty is something that we've been very deeply involved with over the last few years and have contributed many thousands of pounds to that particular project. And then on the 15th of September, we've got Dr. Nat Alcock, who's going to talk to us about Wilmcote, Warwickshire and the Shakespeare family. And it's essentially a talk about research and house history. So if you can join us for one or both of those, we very much appreciate it. And after the break, let's say in August, we'll be back in October and November and December with some more talks, which we are currently planning, and we will get those details out to you in due course. So I'd like to thank everybody this evening for joining us. And all I can do is to wish you a safe journey home. And as always, as was advised 80 years ago, keep calm and carry on. Thank you very much.